So good morning everyone. So for those of you who were around for one of the earlier sessions, my colleague Lottie was talking about free-to-air television from the perspective of broadcasters. How can they improve their position in the streaming world? I'm going to take a slightly different angle now and look at the future of the free-to-air platforms themselves. So first up, what do we mean by free-to-air TV platforms, so as distinct from the broadcasters and the channels that are present on them? Well, for many markets, what we're thinking about is free at the point of access TV products, providing typically an array, certainly of public channels in Europe and potentially commercial channels as well. And they might be branded products, so they might be some of these brands that I've got up on the right-hand side here, so services like Freeview, FreeSat in the UK, Love Us TV in Spain, TVSat, TV in Italy, and TNT in France. And there's a bit of variation in terms of how these work. So in markets like the UK, this is a branded and managed service. There's an entity that exists. In other territories, it might just simply be a mechanism for managing the EPG. And in others still, the platform doesn't really have much of a brand at all. It might just be TV in the same way that in the old analog days, you turn on the TV and you've got a whole bunch of channels, it's just TV. So it's an eclectic bunch of different services, different platforms, some of them branded, some of them unbranded, but all of them united by either a terrestrial or a satellite mechanism delivering an array of free channels to consumers. So all pretty straightforward. So what's happened with the free-to-air market over the last few years? Let's take a look back over the last 20 years, in fact, and look at a little bit of the history of free-to-air television. So back, if we take a look back almost two decades ago, back in 2004, we can see that Europe was predominantly a free-to-air TV market. The vast majority of homes, about 2/3 of them, had access to either a free terrestrial service, could be analog, could be digital, or a free satellite service. And in most markets, it was a free terrestrial. And only about 1/3 of households had a subscription to a cable or a satellite product, like a Sky or a Canal Plus. And those people, we can see in the orange line on this chart versus the free TV households in the blue line. So this chart is essentially showing what proportion of TV households had either a free product or a paid product. Now, as time's gone by, we can see that during the digital terrestrial transition, as people were switching over from analog to digital, simultaneously pay TV platforms were driving their own services. They were driving greater reach, and they were taking advantage of the fact that people were thinking about, rather than just the inertia that carried them forwards on the platform they've always known, what did they do? Many of them switched over to a pay TV platform. So that leaves us in 2015 with a market that's just switched over. So about 54% of households at that point in time had a pay TV subscription, a cable or satellite service, and a little under half had a free TV service. Now, if we fast forward to present day, the market, certainly superficially at least, looks pretty similar. It looks like the market's reached an equilibrium. Pay TV is not growing. Part of that, of course, or a large portion of that, is due to competition with subscription streaming services, and they're eating into the ability of European pay TV services to further grow their platform reach. If we were to look at this picture in the US, you'd see a more aggressive decline in pay TV. So it looks like from this that free-to-air platforms as a whole are holding their own. They're still in about just under half of households, which is the same situation that they were in 2015. But of course, this is very much an illusion. It's not really happening. It's not really unfolding like this. And in fact, when I refer to that group of households as free TV, it's probably not really true. We should probably be thinking them as not pay television services. And that's quite a fragmented bunch of households within this. They all use different services. They all use different ways of watching TV. So we can break that down. So if we think about that 45% of homes in the big Western European markets that don't have pay TV, well, what do they have? Well, some of them are more or less entirely reliant on those free television platforms we looked at in that first slide. About 11% of households are what we'd call free-to-air only. They have a Freeview or a FreeSat or one of the equivalents in the other European markets, and maybe they complement that with a little bit of video-on-demand usage from some of the free streaming services out there, perhaps a bit of catch-up TV, but primarily they're free-to-air only or free-to-air primary home. But the rest of that group has a different breakdown. The biggest chunk are people who have a free-to-air TV platform, maybe they've got Freeview, FreeSat, etc., but they've also got a subscription streaming service. Maybe that's Netflix, it could be Disney, it could be Amazon, it could be one of the local services. And then a further 9% of homes would fall into this streaming-only category. And they would be people who are predominantly looking first to one of the subscription platforms or maybe one of the free-to-view streaming platforms as their primary point of TV access. So that 45% is very much not purely free-to-air TV. So if we were to actually look at that trend and overlay what's happened, it probably looks something a bit more like this, with this opening gap between the theoretical platform reach, the people who don't have pay TV, and the people who are actually accessing free-to-air TV channels via the platforms. And it's not just about aggregate reach of these platforms. Even if we look at the consumption habits within those group of people, those groups of people who have access to a free-to-air TV platform, their consumption habits are also changing. So the chart here is simply looking at the amount of time those people who have a free-to-air television service at home and use it, how much time do they spend watching broadcast TV, or how much time do they think they spend watching broadcast TV, versus how much time they think they spend watching video-on-demand products. And of course, broadcast TV still wins out here. This group of people is still primarily leaning towards the free-to-air channels that they get access to as their main way of viewing. But it's reaching parity. That we're close to 50-50 in terms of the amount of time these people think they spend watching video-on-demand products in orange, and in the blue on here, how much time they spend with broadcast TV. And why is that happening? Well, it's fairly obvious for the most part. Those streaming-only category of households, they essentially have already switched over. But if we look at that free-to-air and subscription streaming platform, and those free-to-air only homes, about 2/3 of those have a smart TV or a streaming adapter. And it's virtually impossible now to buy a TV that isn't smart in some capacity. So it's extremely easy for those nominally free-to-air households to begin shifting towards becoming streaming-only homes. So where does this leave us? Where does it leave the free-to-air broadcast platforms? And where does it leave the future of free-to-air broadcast television? So let's think about how this might all unfold over the next few years. If we extrapolate out from where we are with that chart earlier, with the free television platform reach declining year on year, that's going to continue, broadly speaking, for the next few years. Free-to-air TV platform reach cedes ground. Some viewers either stop connecting their TV to an aerial, or they still connect it to an aerial, but they just stop watching broadcast TV. Simultaneously, partly driven by the fact that people are shifting away from connecting their TVs or watching broadcast TV, even among those viewers who are still watching free-to-air TV, many of them are spending more time in a more flexible streaming environment, so that rather than watching something at 9 or 9:30 or 10, maybe they want to start at 9:07 or 10:13, and they're switching increasingly to an on-demand environment. So what happens in this case? Well, a lot of broadcasters, and my colleague Lottie alluded to this earlier, need to start thinking and have started thinking about their on-demand products, their apps, as the primary go-to location for debuting new content. And that's effectively a bit of a self-fulfilling prophecy there. The more that broadcasters focus on their streaming products to debut new content, the more they drive consumers to their on-demand products, the more the first two continue to happen. So we get to a situation at some point in the future where there's a question about the need for broadcast terrestrial or broadcast satellite. And there's a question from a policymaker perspective, do we need to continue to allocate terrestrial spectrum to broadcast TV, or could we use it for something else that might have other uses? And do the satellite platforms that are offering TV in a few markets become uneconomical? And do they start to close? So is there much of a future for free-to-air television platforms? It's a fair question. Potentially there is, I think. But there are questions about what the role of the free-to-air platform looks like in an IP or a streamed environment. So how might we think about what that role looks like? Well, if I think And it's always a bad idea to take your own personal experiences as a researcher, particularly in this space, because as I think many of us will know, our TV viewing habits are probably not typical of the average consumer. But I think in this case, I'm in a household where I haven't actually connected my TV set to an aerial, so all of my consumption is streamed. So maybe it's a reasonable model for what TV viewing might look like in a streamed world. So let's have a think about what the choices made in a streaming world might mean for free-to-air platforms. So let's imagine an evening in the Broughton household. My wife and I sit down after dinner and we decide we want to watch some TV. What do we do? Well, we don't know necessarily what we want to watch. We finished the latest series, so we turn on our TV. Now, we happen to have a Samsung TV. It could be an LG TV. It could be an Amazon Fire TV connected or a Roku box, whatever. We happen to have a Samsung TV. What do we do? Well, it turns on and we get a fast channel. We could watch that. I'm probably just going to press the Netflix button if I'm really honest. So I press the Netflix button. So that's one option, and I have a look at Netflix. The other option is that we don't press Netflix, and we scroll through the various different apps to find something on our TV. Okay. So a couple of different options. And that leaves a few policy questions. Policy questions around the prominence and discovery of content. Because if you fundamentally believe in the importance of a strong national broadcasting sector and the importance of local content and the importance of public service media, policymakers need to think about a few things. One of those is, how do you ensure that on any connected screen, whether that's my Samsung TV or any other device, public service or other national media products are actually available? Now, in a market like the UK, that's probably not a massive problem because the brands here are so big that if you're a major TV manufacturer, you're probably not going to want to miss out the BBC or ITV. That would be problematic for your device sales. But for many other markets, where are the local public broadcasters going to fall in the priority next to Netflix and the countless other major streaming apps that are going to be further up the queue? Secondly, how do you ensure positioning is favourable for national broadcast? If we think about the EPGs as they're structured today, you have a pretty set ordering for the public service media channels. But how does that work in maybe a more of an EPG-free or an EPG-light world? And lastly, how do you manage search and discovery? So if someone searches for a piece of content, how do you organise the principles behind that to ensure that perhaps platform owners who might quite reasonably want to favour their own products and services don't do that too much and don't act to the detriment of, say, public service media? So there are a few questions here. There are also some questions around what might happen if we think about switching over. We switch off terrestrial, we switch off satellite. And that is, it's a real possibility over the next decade. There have been a number of articles recently talking about whether broadcasters like the BBC might go online only. But that, again, raises a few questions for policymakers. How do we ensure that vulnerable homes aren't cut off? So earlier on, we saw that there are still a fair few households in the UK and in Germany and France and others who still don't have access to streaming products and don't use streaming products. How do we ensure they're not cut off? Well, you tell them they're going to be cut off and they need to take an action. Who tells them? Who communicates with them that terrestrial's being switched off and they need to do something about it? Well, if we think about what happened during the analog-digital transition, many of the platforms that I referenced on the first slide, part of their remit was to ensure that there was a common brand, there was marketing, there were sufficient information out there for consumers to know how they could still get TV after the switchover. And lastly, how do you make this process as simple as possible for consumers? Because particularly for those people who haven't switched over yet, haven't started using streaming products, you need to make the process pretty seamless. It can't be complex navigating through 16 different apps to get to the favourite channel that they want. So there's potentially a role for free-to-air TV platforms in the future in helping organise the transition and organising managing the processes around how TV is delivered in a streaming world. So just quickly to summarise, we've got a market that is steadily transitioning towards a streamed world, and that second digital switchover is indeed very plausible over the next decade. We've got a transition period, potentially, and policymakers are going to need to think about how that switchover is communicated and how it's made simple for consumers in the market. And then lastly, in that streamed-only world, the policymakers also need to be thinking about, if they believe in the principles of universal access and the prominence of public service media and the importance of a national broadcasting sector, how content discovery and how prominence is managed on the various different platforms that are out there. So I think it's quite clear that there is a future for free-to-air television platforms, but it's going to look a little bit different to the way it looks today. So thank you very much.